presenters to stick to their time frames. The thing about Zoom meetings is everyone schedules everything very, very tightly around them. So it's very important that we all try and stick to our times. All the panelists will be available in the Q&A, and indeed even myself if you wish to ask me anything. So feel free to ask a question to either someone specifically or more general. We will manage that. I think, I guess from my perspective is that I think this is a really important session. The code has taken it's been around for a long time. It has undergone evolution along that time, and this last major revision of the code I think is very critical to the industry's future. I'm already seeing on the ground that there is more engagement between growers and winemakers about prices, and that's a direct result from some of these discussions. So I think we're seeing a code already starting to work. A code is not about what's written within it. And Peter, you'll probably talk more about this, but a code's not about what's written within it. It's about the culture it engenders. And I think we need to understand that at the moment. So thank you everyone for coming along. Just remember, keep yourself on mute while you can. Put your questions forward on the chat, and then we'll have time afterwards. So I'm going to hand over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Tony, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'll try to be brief and just give a little bit of a background to developments over what's been the last 12 or 14 months with the review of the code, as Tony indicated. And I believe then the real detail and interest will be in what Anna and Eric present. But certainly the review of the code, long-standing as it's been, was prompted by the ACCC's report and recommendations against what they saw as the effectiveness or otherwise of the old code. And in tackling this, I was invited to join the committee as an independent chair of that exercise. And I think the first step that we made was really to establish clearly defined principles accepted by all. And I think, as Tony said, it's really that sort of activity that underpins the culture, that we can agree on principles even if we don't agree on a lot of the specifics or wish to maybe interpret them a little differently. The reality certainly was, in the process of more than a few meetings, that we did not reach full consensus on all the issues, but we made good progress on several of them, despite the COVID, despite the latter period of anxiety around the Chinese market and the like, such that I think we've ended up with a much progressed code relative to the old and subsequently revised versions. It's left us in a position where we should see this as a work in progress, subject to improvements as we go, and there's inbuilt opportunities for review, and in fact an expectation that it be assessed and reviewed and refreshed. The key elements of progress, I believe, were around much amplified and more timely market information and accessibility, the fact that price offers as opposed to indicative prices, real price offers are to be made earlier. The terms across the board are to hit the minimum of equivalent to the South Australia legislated approach, and with an encouragement in the code and the background documents that people adopt better terms than that over time. There's certainly clarification around dispute clauses, and maybe for this morning's presentation, perhaps one of the more encouraging elements ought to be seen as the progressive development of objective measures that Eric will talk about it. So it's the objective measures and the procedures around them that I think are very important. So I won't dwell on making more broad comment, except to say that the progressive improvement is there. I think it's given scope for much greater buy-in and much better engagement around the culture that this code is intended to drive. And we all know that staying together and keeping a great culture is going to be one of the strengths that we'll need to rely on given the challenges that are before us. So thanks. If I can leave it at that and go to Anna, I'll stay through the session and happy to join any panel.
Thanks, Peter, very much. That's a very good description. I think Peter's point that this is a period of continuous improvement is a really good one. So I'd just like now to introduce Anna Hooper. Anna, of course, you all know and has worked very closely on the code and probably knows more about the revision than any of us. So Anna, over to you.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much to everyone that's made the effort to come along today. So as Peter and Tony said, today, the purpose of today for me is to drill down into some of the details of the new code and explain a little bit about what the changes mean for your business. At a recent Growers Summit that was held back in August, I provided some background as to why we undertook to review the code, and also talked more specifically about the ACCC's interest in the wine industry and how some of their recommendations have influenced this review process. And that presentation is available on our website under the events sections. So the purpose of today's session is not to repeat too much of that, but rather to drill down a little more into what signing up to the new code means, and if you're yet to sign the new code, what the key improvements are since the previous code for those who are existing signatories. I'll just go back. Whether you're a winemaker looking to buy the best fruit you possibly can, or a grape grower looking to ensure that you have a fair supply contract, the code will provide a valuable tool for your business to improve contractual relationships. It does this through providing a framework for clarifying expectations between you and your growers or your purchasing wineries, and to generally improve that business-to-business culture that's so important for a healthy and sustainable wine sector. A flow-on effect of a good code is that it will promote excellence in grape growing by helping to build confidence to growers that they'll receive due reward where due reward is due. And our code is a non-prescribed voluntary code. The alternative, which is a mandatory code, tends to be much more intrusive. They're compulsory, they're regulated by the government, and they're less flexible and adaptable to change. So this is something we don't think would be constructive, and we're working hard to avoid that situation. A mandatory code would potentially stifle innovation due to that lack of flexibility in terms of what you can do in your contracts under a mandatory code. And that idea of excessive regulation is also at odds with the concept of a competitive market, which is obviously what we want. So a mandatory code is something we could find ourselves with if we could find the government mandating such a code if we don't improve upon the number of signatories to this voluntary code. So step one for everyone who's not yet a signatory today is to check if you're on the list of signatories that's published on the code website. And if you're not on the list, and if you're a winemaker who buys fruit, I urge you to sign up, and you can do this via our website. Our homepage is here, and you can see there's a link to the code website there, which will take you to the sign up page here. Sign up occurs directly online, so it's very simple and quick. You could do it during the presentation if you'd like to. And apparently I've heard Tony's offered to do a lap around Lake Burley Griffin for every new signatory that we get today. So why sign up? Many winemakers will sign up to the code purely to demonstrate a commitment to fair and equitable dealings to their existing and potential growers, and to demonstrate good moral citizenship. But signing will also promote mutually beneficial relationships with growers, and the flow-on effects are encouraging the pursuit of quality, ensuring transparency regarding pricing and other contractual requirements, and also just making sure that all your contracts are lawful and fair, which will in turn reduce the likelihood of legal disputes. Signatories have at their fingertips a fast and effective, relatively cheap dispute resolution process if it is ever required. And also, as I said before, if we all sign collectively as a sector, we'll be demonstrating that we've got this covered, and that will protect against the mandatory code. So transitional provisions. what does it mean when you sign up? Both existing signatories and new signatories who sign the code prior to July 2021 will need to comply with this code from July 2021 in their new agreements. And for those who are already signatories, the code has transitional provisions that if you're a signatory to the previous code, you'll automatically become a signatory to this code. And being a new or existing signatory involves offering to amend existing agreements within 3 months. So in effect, we'll see provisions of this code taking effect by vintage 2022, but there's nothing to prevent you from applying the provisions sooner either. Some of the key benefits I'm going to go through now, but I also just want to make note of the fact, and Peter alluded to this during the process with the Code Committee, that we really needed to tackle some challenging issues head on. And there was a number of issues raised by growers, often relating back to that bargaining power imbalance with large wineries. And we recognised the importance of these issues, but we also recognised the importance of maintaining flexibility to avoid restricting people from entering into commercial agreements that were mutually beneficial and suitable for both parties. So ultimately, we needed to ensure that there were no major deterrents to new signatories. And I think it's also really important to keep in mind that it's not the job of the code to solve supply-demand issues or to set pricing. But some of the key highlights we've got in the code compared to the previous code is that the code mandates certain aspects are documented in agreements. So these agreements, and this is aimed at making sure agreements are very clear and transparent. And this applies whether or not you have a long-term contract or a spot contract made on the fly. It's suggested it should be documented. Everything should be documented to make sure we've got that clarity. And there's also some recommendations that winemakers can put in place to ensure growers' rights are protected, and consideration, for example, consideration as to how risk due to harvest delays from logistical problems beyond a grower's control might potentially be shared between both parties. Price transparency. We've aimed to provide confidence regarding the mechanisms for determining the price. It's a little different to the previous code in that there's no indicative pricing anymore, but we've retained sufficient flexibility so that winemakers and grower agreements can encourage quality improvements in their contracts. Price doesn't necessarily need to be determined at the time of entering into long-term agreements, but we do need to ensure that the grower has some certainty about how that price will be set and at what point in time they'll be provided with a price. And this enables things like quality-based incentives or even pricing that reflects the market at the time, or a combination of both. Winemakers have the flexibility to offer their growers upgrades or bonuses by providing a base price that can be adjusted up at any time, but still providing the grower confidence that the price cannot be reduced unless the grapes fail to meet specifications that are contained within the contract. Market-based price offers must be determined by the second Wednesday of December in warmer climates and the second Wednesday of January for the cooler regions. However, objectively calculated prices or an upward price adjustment can be made at a later date. Quality assessment is obviously closely linked to pricing determination and really relates to how we assess grape quality for the purpose of making decisions to either reject, downgrade or upgrade. Grapes may be assessed in vineyard, winery or weighbridge against specifications, the obvious ones being Beaumet, pest and disease, but there's a number of others. And it's important to note that with this code, deductions and rejections are not allowable unless the grapes have failed to meet these types of objective specifications that have been clearly stated in the contract, and evidence to support downgrades or rejections should be documented and accessible in the event of a dispute. And as we'll hear later from Eric, AWR is developing standard procedures for measurements of these specifications. In practice, it's common that grapes or the resulting wine are assessed for other quality measures that rely partly or fully on personal judgment and therefore may be prone to ambiguity. And this is still allowable in the new code or the amended code, but only for the purpose of upgrading or awarding bonuses above a known base price. So subjective measures are not a substitute for assessing the quality where objective measures are available. So timing and methodology of any assessments and notification must be specified, and the grower must be fully aware of how quality related decisions are made. And as I said, Eric will talk a little bit more about that later. The code has an expanded dispute mechanism. The dispute mechanism was strengthened, taking on board the advice of the ACCC. So there's now a structured process for adverse quality assessments at both the vineyard and the winery, which includes the weighbridge, and this is through independent expert determination. The code also includes now a conciliation process, which is a form of mediation, like procedure for other types of disputes that may occur. The code has slight changes about payment terms. This involved quite a lot of deliberation and discussion at the code committee level. And in the end, the committee considered the pros and cons of mandating for shorter payment terms and concluded that payment terms should be a matter for commercial decision making, so long as parties pay heed to the general principle that money is worth more the sooner the less received. So payment terms under the code remain unchanged and based on the 3-tiered system in line with SA legislation. However, it should be stressed that these terms are not considered best practice, and the code makes note of the fact that lengthy payment terms and contracts could be considered unfair under Australian consumer law. So really the ACCC recommends that long-term payment periods should be phased out, and we'd really like to see that happen in favour of 30-day payment terms. And the code also now states that where payment terms are not met, that interest should be paid at commercial rates. Some of the other changes in the code are that there's a freedom of association clause, which states that growers should not be discouraged from forming an association with growers, provided that that is made for lawful purposes and it may require ACCC approval. Parties to an agreement may mutually negotiate alternative arrangements as to what's set out in the code. That's no different to the previous code. However, now it quite clearly states that where negotiated alternate arrangements are made compared to what's in the code, that they must leave the grower no worse off. Timeframes for disputes are now slightly shorter and are differentiated rather than by the type of dispute. They're differentiated into time-sensitive and non-time sensitive disputes, which sort of takes into account whether grapes are waiting on the weighbridge or deteriorating on the vine, and therefore need to be resolved much more quickly. There's a suite of supporting information on the code website, and a great deal of work has gone into developing this, particularly on behalf of the AWRI with their industry endorsed standard procedures. And they've been developed to ensure that quality assessments are conducted according to current best practice. And we have a few methods up on the code site at the moment, and there's more to come. There's also a template for spot contracts and verbal agreements, so these can be quickly backed up in writing, and to ensure that all the critical information under the code is included. A link to Wine Australia's market information reports, and finally a list of independent experts who may be called upon in the case of a dispute. We're looking to expand this list, so if there's anyone in the webinar who thinks they might be suitably qualified, please do get in touch. I'd like to also extend a really big thank you to our Code Management Committee who volunteered their time and exceptional expertise, and particularly our independent chair, Peter Hayes, in developing what I think is a really fantastic code. Thanks to Phillinsons, who've not only assisted with legal editing and polishing, but have been really engaged throughout the process, and their roadshows have educated people about what's about lawful contracts. Those roadshows over the last 2 years have been really valuable for those who've been able to attend. To our Code Secretariat, the Accord Group, and AWRI and Wine Australia. So just to sum up, the code's a valuable tool for improving relationships and ensuring that contracts are fair and lawful. It outlines a process for resolving disputes in the unfortunate event that they might arise. We strongly advise anyone who's not yet signed up to this code to sign the code, and also If you are not sure if you're a signatory to the code, to check the code website. So if you are, if you're a grower, check the list of signatories and encourage your wineries to sign up to the code. Because if we don't get enough signatories, particularly from the larger wineries, then it is very likely that we'll be served a mandatory code in the not too distant future, which is not something that we would like to see. During this webinar, I encourage you to ask as many questions as you can, and we'll be using those questions to develop a set of FAQs. But also, if you don't get to ask the question, or if a question comes up later, as everyone knows, I could talk about the code until the cows come home. So I'd be really happy for anyone who wants to contact me direct to do so, and ask any additional questions that might arise after today. And finally, thank you everyone so much for your attendance, and to all those who are signing up to this new code as we speak. And I'll now hand back to Eric, I think.
Thanks, Anna. And feel free to get all your questions in ready for Anna, and make sure she'll be here to answer them. But of course, after this, both Anna and myself, and indeed anyone else in Australian Grape and Wine is willing to answer questions. I think the critical thing from Anna's point is the code is just a tool, and there's a much bigger issue, and that is making sure that we develop better relationships between growers and winemakers. That is the real reason that a mandatory code doesn't work. It doesn't help the relationships at all. It just creates a bigger potential for conflict. And I think nothing will work until we just get better relationships. And a lot of that depends on supply and demand. One of the really critical elements of this is not in the code itself, but it's the industry guidelines about best practice wine grape assessments. This issue is something that's been around since Noah was a boy, and it's about having to get a better form of objective measurements for and understanding how decisions are made both in the vineyard and on grading and on quality and on price. And so it's really important that we can start to demystify this and make it more transparent. So we've been working very close with Eric. If you don't know Eric, Eric is a genius, runs commercial services stuff at the AWRI, and he will take you through where we're going. Now, this is a work in progress, and we'll continue to refine these guidelines for best practice, and we'll continue to evolve them depending on demand. So over to you, Eric.
Thanks, mate. Although genius is definitely a concerning phrase through here. I'm not going to get into the details of any individual methods, so I only have time to give you an overview of what we're doing. But as Tony says, the big thing to remember is that these are works in progress, and they will evolve with time and technology. What we think is best practice today, as we develop new technologies or new things become available to us, we will continue to modify and develop these and make sure they're fit for purpose. So here, these are the overall responses that with AWRI have committed to based on the ACCC's report and feedback from AGW and Wine Australia and the growers in general. The first one is formulation of a range of industry endorsed standard procedures. In other words, just standard methods. You'll hear them referred to going forward as IESPs, because if it doesn't have an acronym, it obviously isn't real. So we've got an acronym now that works for us. But these are formal reference methods that define how to measure each of the required analytes. And they include information on minimum calibration, validation, and uncertainty of measurement, or the expected error, if you like, through there. They'll also include requirements to validate internal methods against the reference, either internally or externally. So what I mean by that is, this is the reference method. We don't expect every facility to change everything they're doing in detail to that absolute method. But what they need to do is validate in some way that what they're doing gives the equivalent result to the standard reference method. And that's a really important step, because it's impossible to cover every piece of equipment, every piece of technology that could possibly be used for this. I mean, there are literally hundreds of different refractometers out there, When it comes to spectrometers for color measurement, there's hundreds of those. We can't define the method, the equipment as such as in that way. And what's suitable for a gigantic winery is not necessarily going to be suitable for a small operation. So what we do is we define a reference method and then how you validate your internal methods against that. And that's a really important step to understand there. Another important thing to take note of is that these have to meet the international standards for methods, and they will have to be improved by the National Measurement Institute, at least in the case of bricks and color. So when you have a look at one of these methods, the first response of nearly everyone, and it would be my response as well, is this is so much dross and so much unnecessary information in here. Why is it like this? That's because it's got to meet a national standard. It's not something that we just put in the simple steps of this is what you do. It's got to reflect a regulatory approach for this sort of thing. So keep that in mind when you see these things, that they're not too hard to do, but they do have a lot more information there, or probably can be best described as incredibly geeky or nerdy, but that's for a reason. We're also going to have to do some trial work where required for validation of procedures, and this includes further refining the levels of error that are expected in them and what needs to be done when you're doing sampling at places like the Weybridge. We're going to actually, this vintage, the plan is to do Weybridge sampling trials where we look and see how many samples do you actually have to take from a bin using a Maselli or doing hand selection of fruit to actually get a representative sample. We don't have the information published out there at the moment. We all have a very good feel for it, but we need to validate that and show what's happening there. So that's another important step for some of these things. For some of the methods, they're so well defined already, we don't need to do much extra trial work, but for some of the others, we do need to develop it. And unfortunately, that does take time. We're also going to develop a range of guidance documents, and you can probably think of these as the how-to plain English versions of the methods. So we'll have these formal reference methods, which will be out there, but then we're going to put together a set of guidelines, if you like, which just say, this is how you actually do this in the real world, how you apply it. It'll take out, they won't include all the formal material that we need to have in there, but the idea is they'll give you a clear outline. This is what I've got to do. This is how I calibrate it. And if I need to validate something different, I do it this way roughly. They're going to be quite important because they'll be the version that most people refer to regularly, but we do have to highlight that, you know, you need to show that you are meeting the requirements of the formal methods as well. And the final part that we obviously need to get out there and will come together as we get these guidelines done are training materials for industry. So we can get out there, give roadshows, webinars, clear indications of how this works, references that you can go back to and have a quick look at for if you've got a question, all the sort of normal materials that makes it practical to do this kind of testing. So realistically, what you're seeing on this slide, which has got way too many words and I apologize, but is going from having formal, scientifically rigorous methods all the way through to training on how you physically do it and have a bit of confidence in what's happening there. So where are we up to with this at the moment? As I said, everything's a work in progress and they always will be. We'll always be reviewing, checking and getting as much feedback from industry as possible. But the two that were highlighted by the ACCC were bricks or total dissolved solids and colour. Luckily, they were the ones which had the most information out there. It would have been really nice just to be able to say, reference Patrick Ireland's book and just follow those rules, but unfortunately they don't meet our requirements for a formal method. So we do have the bricks and colour version 1 available. They're up on the website. We're looking for as much feedback as people want to, and I've seen that there's a couple of comments already in the chat sessions around those. And yeah, we're going to continue to refine those, make them workable, and then hopefully have a reasonably smooth process for those to be approved by NMI, so that there's no dispute about them being acceptable to go forward. The next two that are already drafted but are under review and being modified, one on titratable acidity. Yes, it's not actually used for payment realistically anywhere, but it is an important method when people are assessing when to harvest, etc. So we felt that we should get one done for that. It's just under review at the moment. The next version 1 of it should be out by the end of October. The next one is secondary methods, and that's how do we, if we're using a totally different technology, like something like near infrared or NIR measurements or FTIR measurements, in other words, something that's not a primary method to do bricks and color, how do you validate that to show that it gives the same results as a normal refractometer or a spectrometer? That's a really important method that we need to get out there so that large companies can demonstrate that what they're doing isn't a black box. It's actually doing something that can be compared to normal reference methods. So that one is actually quite complex, but we still hope to have it out by the end of October. We're currently drafting vineyard sampling and weighbridge sampling, hopefully to have vineyard sampling done by the end of October and weighbridge sampling by the end of November. We fully expect those to need some development and trial work going forward. Vineyard sampling is obviously a huge one. Luckily, there's a great deal of good reference material out there to do that. Weighbridge sampling will need some trial work. Another one that doesn't exist yet, but we're hoping to have a draft by the end, available for the end of November, is sample retention. And that's about how long can you store frozen grapes for color and bricks measurements or for any other reassessment after the event. It's going to be really important that we have that for the dispute resolution process. Fair bit of work to do on that, pulling some science out of some pretty diverse sources to understand that. And then the last two that are on our current list, and I know this list will expand as we go forward, is MOG assessment and pest and disease assessment. They're still in the planning stages as we basically review all the available literature and what's out there, and we hope to have drafts of those available by the end of December so we can start the industry reference process for those. So that's the work plan at the moment. We are behind where we were hoping to be when we started this process late last year, but we had a small thing with bushfires and then a bit of issue with some virus around the place. But we're still in line for this timeline, and hopefully we'll be able to have things available as people need them. So the other work that we've got going on as well, which is being funded essentially by a grant that AGW was successful in getting, is an active review of Wendy Allen's wine grape assessment in the vineyard and at the winery. We're just trying to bring that up to date with the latest information, referencing all our standard procedures and adding information on how to apply uncertainty of measurement to winery tolerances, getting some definitions in there and just bringing it up to speed. It's a great document already. We're just refining it and probably modernizing it. That should be ready in the relatively near future. We're also working on development of standard sensory protocols for grape assessment. This is broadly based on an international standards organization standard on measuring quality through sensory testing. But we want to make sure it's done in the vineyard and winery context. And we're leaning really, really hard on the work that has been done this year from the bushfires, where we did a lot of trial work and development based around sensory assessment for smoke. Now, this methodology isn't going to define what smoke is or what quality is. That's not the idea. What it's going to outline is, if you're going to use sensory, here's the basic steps that you need to do to make sure it's rigorously done and has a degree of objectivity in it. Finally, one that I've been working on in the background for actually a couple of years now, because it's such a weird thing to try to get across to people, but a guideline to the development of uncertainty of measurements in the vineyard and winery context. In other words, how do you understand the errors behind the methods you're using? And then how do you apply them to the tolerances that are already applied in the winery? And this is not something that's straightforward. It makes a lot of sense to a nerd like myself, not a genius, but a nerd. But it really isn't always that intuitive, and you need to understand where it is, especially if there's going to be an issue of dispute resolution, or heaven forbid, if we get into litigation. And, you know, there is a very big difference between a winery setting its tolerances. It will accept fruit between this measurement and this measurement. And then there is for any given sample, how much error there is. And the two are different things, and you can't apply them as one. So you will have a tolerance that the winery accepts, but then you have to say, all right, for a given sample, how big is the possible error, or how far away is the result likely to be from the real number? And so we want to be able to give some really clear information for people to be able to apply these uncertainties of measurement in a realistic and viable way. So I'm running out of time really quickly, and I knew I was going to do that. So we'll leave everything else for questions. But other than that, thank you for your attention, and yeah, look forward to questions and helping out any way I can.
Thanks, Eric, and a really good presentation. I think the critical element again is the fact that while we have all the nerdish bits that Eric needs to put in so the NMI can agree to, it needs to be practical as well. And that's we are seeking input to ensure that whatever we do can be applied in a practical sense. So that's really important. Look, we'll now go on to some of the questions, and feel free to send any more in. There's been a number of really good questions, and the first question, apart from the fact that I never promised to run around Lake Burley Griffin, which for those uninformed is 34 full kilometres, because I've done it. It's to do that for every signatory, I'd be going for a long, long time. But happy to do the 5K bridge to bridge. Do growers sign up to the code as well? The answer is no. It's winemakers that are obliged to sign, but I would encourage all grape growers to encourage the wineries they deal with to sign to that. So that's good. A couple of really interesting one was about, is the whole philosophy for this, and the question itself was, does the larger balance of onus or responsibility for work in the code, the contracts, the upkeep and communications, it's making more potential, I guess, conflict between winemakers and grape growers, adding extra work and complexity, and probably further disengaging growers. And the comment is that they're not sure it's balanced to a fair outcome. I mean, I agree with that, and I think that's why we've tried to move away from the code being black law and just try and move it. It's got to be a guide. It's not a silver bullet, and it's something that needs to guide change in cultures. And does anyone want to take that from the panel, that question?
I'm happy to. Peter, unless you want to.
Go for it.
Oh, you go, Anna. You go.
I think it's probably worth pointing out that when we developed the code, every single provision or clause that got put in the code was subject to a lot of discussion, and a lot of that discussion focused around, do we need this to be in the code? And for most part, where it has been written into the code, it's because it was deemed important. Some of it was because of advice from the ACCC, but a lot of it was because potentially there were things that hadn't been thought through, and they were detracting from critical issues such as transparency of pricing, and how communication's put to a grower, particularly if it's about a rejection decision that might be incredibly costly for that grower. So yeah, I suppose to sum up, I think that it was, for everything that we put in there that was going to be onerous on the winemaker, we were very cognizant to the fact that the benefit had to outweigh the cost.
Thanks, Anna.
Tony, I think I'd simply add that, reinforcing Anna's comment, that there was quite a deal of scrutiny on what went in and what went out, but ultimately the credibility and integrity of the relationship and the integrity of the industry as a reputable deal is at the core of this. So I think culture is first and foremost the thing, and the fact that people need to have discipline in their business procedures.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Next question I have is the AWRI. There's two parts to this question. I think does the AWRI colour measurement, uncertainty measurement, it's defined as plus or minus 10%. And the question is how fair it is to use this as a pricing mechanism. I think before we talk about fair or unfair, Eric, it might be worthwhile explaining a little bit more about uncertainty measurement and how it fits in.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's probably not a topic that I can cover in today's thing by itself, because it is complex. That error really is driven to a large extent by the variation in a group of berries at any time. So, that if we had a truly homogeneous set of samples, the actual error is down at 1 or 2%. But when you start pulling berries off a bunch and then you choose 100 grams of them from that part, and then if you choose another 100 grams, you start to see those errors come there. We're redefining, and as I said, we're continuing to work on this. We think that we're probably going to define the number as plus or minus 5% for a given homogenate, which will probably address a little bit of that. And the way errors work is, it's not a number which is done by adding up, all the possible errors that come into these things. In this case, it literally is by looking at the distribution of results. And so the reality is that 2/3 of the results are within 2 or 3%. 90% of them are within about 5%. And then you've got always a few outliers, which is because there's 1 or 2 really bad berries or something that goes into that process. So we are trying to put some extra controls in there to reduce those uncertainties of measurement into the process. But it is it's to a certain extent the reality of what we see, because we're dealing with a non-homogeneous product. You can't actually get a group of berries and say they're all going to be the same, and depending on what you choose, you're going to get a bit of variability through there. Now, the easy way to reduce this, and it is quite an easy way to reduce it, is if we did the measurement 10 times, then the error would get down to quite small amounts, but then no one would ever get any measurements done because it would take so long. So there is always this trade-off between, okay, what can we practically do in a winery and define it, versus what can we do at the ultimate level of scientific measurement. So that trade-off is one that we have to make in that process, because we've already had lots of feedback saying these methods are already too onerous. It's too hard for anyone to do. How could we ever do this? So where are we going to go with that?
Yeah.
So yeah.
So thanks, Eric. Yeah, no. And look, and measurement uncertainty to me is one of the critical elements in both the relationship between growers and winemakers, but also on the regulatory front as well. And it's something that I'm really supportive of the work you're doing. Look, the fairness factor is a different one. I think what's really critical is that if we understand the uncertainty in measurements and both parties understand it, it becomes something we can, I guess, can be discussed and is open and transparent. Peter, is there anything you want to add on that respect?
I think in the end, the critical one is what are the important measurements and what's the tolerance that wineries will place upon acceptability of a product. So if you're at the margin, your lower limit is said to be 11.5 Beaumet, let's say, or bricks, and I see Jason's got a question about that very question of interchangeability of terms. you know, at the margin, what is the acceptance or rejection threshold? And that's where I think Eric's comment about reproducibility and the number of samples that you might have to take. So I don't think you, again, in an appropriate relationship, you wouldn't just say my number is the number, because there is no such thing.
Thanks, Peter. Another question is about the communication of this. Clearly, we are revising the website, and the communications on the website. We're actually in the process of completely redoing our entire website as well. So everything will be a lot clearer. Obviously, like everyone, we have been constrained by finances, and but with COVID, we're all becoming more and more digital. So yes, we'll certainly be revising what our website it looks like, and where we're going on there for our communications. Another and critical to this as well is it is important we get particularly those wineries greater than 10,000 tonnes in the inland regions to sign up. We do have quite a detailed communications and advocacy program with those wineries, which we've started some time ago. Anna, do you want to talk a little bit about what our future steps are to try and make sure that we get enough people to sign up to this to make it meaningful? And remember, for us, it's not just about meeting a target to satisfy ACCC. Yes, that's important, but it's about improving the relationship between growers and winemakers. That's what we're all about. Anna, do you want to take that one on?
Tony said, whilst the ACCC is really interested in wineries over 10,000 tonnes first and foremost, and so our plan is to contact as many of those wineries that we can identify as possible, and that's wineries with the processing capacity, including subsidiaries, of 10,000 tonnes. But that said, I think from a wine sector culture point of view, it's important that we get more than just the large wineries to sign up to this code. So there'll be a combination of making personal contact. We're going to continue on with various different educational programs. Training of independent experts is going to be something for next year, so that we can have more people who are available to help with that dispute resolution process, which is one of the key benefits of being a signatory to the code. And just continue to promote the importance of signing up to the code at things like this webinar. And then the whole other side of it is this quality assessment education. And I think there's a lot of benefit for people to understand how to make better quality assessments. So we're also going to be running training programs around those along with AWRI next year. And I think probably just one last thing to say is signing the code is one thing, but the ACCC in their market study also really stressed the point about improving payment terms. So whilst we landed on payment terms under the code that were the same as the previous code, i.e. South Australian, what's legislated in the South Australian Wine Grapes Industry Act, those third payments, they are a bare minimum. And I think as well as trying to promote signatories to the code, we're also going to be working really hard to try and encourage people to improve their payment terms over and above that minimum that's set in the code.
Thanks, Anna. And I would just add that I know of a number of growers who are currently negotiating payment terms that are above and beyond what's in the code. And I think that's incumbent on growers and winemakers to sit down and talk about it. And the code is very clear that the ability to negotiate is really important. And I think once people are more confident about that, that will be very helpful. Another question for you, Anna. Has there been a simple starting contract template provided that growers and winemakers can access and build to meet their needs around the code for the 2021 vintage?
Yes, it's a very simple, very vanilla sort of template, and it's really designed for spot contracts and verbal agreements made on the fly in the heat of the moment during vintage, so that you've got a template there that gives you what the bare minimum of any contractual agreement should be. That's available on the Code of Conduct website, so you can access the Code of Conduct website to download that via our website, or just at Wine, it was in my PowerPoint presentation.
On the Code of Conduct.
www.wineindustrycode.org.au, is that right? and it's in supporting information. So there's a link to download that there.
Now, another one from one geek to another. Thanks, Jason. Eric, yes, will we be needing to transfer from BOMA to BRICS with the new IESP?
Only Jason, because we feel his life needs to be tougher. No, we're just using BRICS as that was the worldwide. BRICS is a little bit more standard through there, but within the method, we actually say this is a conversion factor and use whichever unit you like. You can actually use direct, refractive units if you want to. BRICS is just the language we use in that, and we talk about how you convert between the two if you need to.
Thanks, Eric. Another good one for you, Eric. So likely to be more work on regional assessments of key varieties using UV-Vis scans as part of the secondary methods?
No one's funding that at all at the moment, mainly because the variability in the definition of what is quality when it comes to wines varies from winery to winery. So our focus is more on standardizing the measurement techniques, and then people can look at how they want to do quality from there. To actually mandate a quality measurement and say this color corresponds to this quality, then it limits the amount of innovation that a winery can make, because if they want to make a lighter color wine because that suits their style, then how does that link to the quality? So it's a really difficult area. We're always happy to do work in that space because it's interesting, but I don't think it's being funded anywhere at the moment.
I think the important thing about that too, Eric, is that if a winery starts to use those methods, then that methods needs to be validated and clear. And that's the kind of the issue that we try and get across.
And we'll get in, some of the stuff around secondary methods that I mentioned earlier will touch on how you validate that and how you have to show that links.
And clearly, again, probably for you, Anna, training and extension for some of this implementation phases. Is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, as I knew what I've already said, there's I think that training will be an ongoing thing. There's a lot of facets to training. There's helping people to understand quality assessments and how to interpret the industry endorsed standard procedures, or interpret and implement them correctly. There's training for independent determination, so that where there's a dispute, that's we have the right people around who can make an arbitration or a determination in the case of a dispute over quality or price. And I suppose just in educating the industry of the importance of signing up to the code.
Thanks. Now, there's a question about what's driving the ACCC to push for shorter payment terms. I'll take this one, and it's simple philosophy, and it's also the fact that the ACCC Ag Commissioner is a blatant publicity hound, and he likes to get headlines. So their desired outcome is a 30-day payment terms. They're not really interested in the practicalities of payment or otherwise. Obviously, some companies pay 30 days, some pay longer, but as long as it's negotiated, that's okay. The ACCC themselves, when they decided on 30 days, it was actually recommended to the Commission they do a 60-day payment term. He took it on his own to make that shorter. So it's a philosophy and pursuit of headlines. It's not based on logic. It's not based on industry understanding. And the one thing that we do know from all this is that the ACCC had a lot of problems in understanding what this industry looks like. Have I got any other questions?
While you're looking, Tony, can I just add, for those who, I've just had some emails, that the presentations will be available online on our website. We're recording it today. So if anyone needs to share this with their colleagues, or to anyone that needs to see it, then it will be available on our website. And we can send through a link to everyone that's registered.
So thanks, Anne. And given the time it is, we are out of time. Look, if there's any other questions, you just ring Anna. So she will give her mobile number. She is free to talk about this and willing. So we'll give as much guidance on this as we can. Expect to see us out, particularly in the warm inland regions, talking to winemakers about this, but growers as well. I would encourage growers to talk to us about what it means. and as well. So I've already had quite a few discussions with people from, ranging from Queensland down through the warm inland region, northeast Victoria and South Australia. So there is a lot of interest. For mine, I think this is a good piece of work. I think the old code was working. Our problem was we didn't get enough signatories. We need to get people to sign up. If we don't get people to sign up and people to walk the talk on this, then we will be in a lot more trouble, and we will end up with a mandatory code, and no one will win from a mandatory code. Grape growers and winemakers, it will create a burden that you don't need. If you want to know more about that, talk to anyone in the dairy industry. They've got a mandatory code. No one is happy. The people with cows, the people who process milk, it's made everyone unhappy, and that's what would happen to us. So that concerns me, but I also believe that we can get better relationships. So I'm going to close the session now. As I say, anyone got any more questions, please give Anna a call, give me a call. We're more than happy to talk. And thank you very much for all the speakers. Thank you very much for all the participants, and any questions, talk to us. So
I'll just close by putting my number up on the screen too.
that's a good idea. Peter.
No, that's just
Oh,
Thanks, everyone.
okay.
thanks all.
Thanks, folks. That was excellent.
We'll talk again. Bye.